Hey, I'm Rob Teigen.
And I'm Joanna Teigen. Rob and I have been married over 30 years and share an addiction to coffee, bookstores, and Christmas music.
We often debate how many dogs are enough and who should win the voice every season.
We're a neat freak married to a not-so-neat freak, an explorer to a homebody, and an introvert to a people person.
But we do agree that our vows are for always, children are a gift, and prayer is powerful.
Our hope through this podcast is that we can walk with you in caring for the soul of your family. Thanks for being here.
Hi, and welcome to the Growing Home Together podcast. You know, even before Joanna and I were married, we spent a lot of time dreaming about being parents and having kids. And I'm grateful to God that today we have 2 wonderful sons and 3 beautiful daughters. And fatherhood has been one of the greatest parts of my life, I have to say. But while parenting is awesome, we all know it is not easy as well. You know, and if I had to pick one of the hardest parts, I think it's when my kids break down and start to cry. As a dad, that just breaks my heart, and I want to make it all better as soon as possible. And it's hard to see them feeling those emotions and know how to handle it sometimes.
Right. And, you know, when our kids feel sad, it stirs up a lot of feelings in us, too. We want so much to help them cope with their sad emotions in the best way that they can. But for most of us, we don't always know where to start. You know, we wonder how to comfort them. How do we help them understand themselves? And how do we show them that God can meet them in their sadness? So that is why we are so glad to have today's guest with us today. Michelle Nietert is a professional counselor of 25 years, and she's a popular speaker and a frequent guest on national television and podcast. And she's the host of the Raising Mentally Healthy Kids podcast. She is also an accomplished author with a brand new book to share with us today, God, I Feel Sad, Bringing Big Emotions to a Bigger God. Thank you so much, Michelle, for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to talk with you and interact with your audience.
Yeah, this is great. So, Michelle, I've seen your clinical experience and the wealth of resources you've created, and it seems like you could speak into almost every age and stage of the kids' development and mental health. So what led you to create your book, God, I Feel Sad, and target kind of those younger children?
Well, we do know that right now, depending on which study you see, anywhere from 1 in 3 to 1 in 5 kids is struggling with a mental health diagnosis post-COVID. And so with that, I even before then saw this wave of just change with the pressure of our culture coming, that more and more numbers were growing with kids struggling with depression in our office. And really and truly, unresolved sadness, unresolved grief, a lot of times leads to depression. You can also have untreated anxiety and ADHD that will create hopelessness, but very much so, this feeling of sad can lead this way. And I really wanted to equip parents to become the emotional compasses for their kids, because what I see happening in our culture, if you talk to kids, and I talk to them a lot, they tell you that the one thing they never want to do is disappoint their parents. So especially if they've shown sadness before and it's distressed the parent, and it's hard. I'm a mom. I'm in the parenting trenches with you guys. It's the hardest thing I've ever experienced. I've been a therapist and I've watched people go through trauma, but to watch my own kids be sad and disappointed and even at times emotionally overwhelmed is so hard. And so I think it's just really important that parents get some skills to become their kids' emotional compasses until God can become their emotional compass. I believe we're a vessel for that. And that is why I wrote God, I Feel Sad, because I wanted to create a book that would comfort kids, that would turn them towards God, that would prevent maybe some future depression, and that would involve parents in their lives in the process.
Oh, that is so good. And I love the term that you use of being an emotional compass. That's really a neat way to look at it. I know that I wish that we'd had your book when our kids were littler. I mean, it would have been really great to read that together when they went through things like moving away from their friends, or, you know, they had to deal with some mean kids at school, or like our youngest son who's adopted, just working through some really sad feelings sometimes around his adoption history. So in those kind of situations where our kids are feeling sad, maybe right out of the box, if you could give us some specific ways that we can respond as moms and dads that are the most helpful in those moments.
I think one of the most important things is to not gloss over their sadness. And what I mean by that is not minimize it or try to fix it immediately. I think those are our natural responses. We have a different perspective than a small child. We've spent a lot more time on this earth where there is suffering. And so sometimes when a child's really disappointed over maybe not getting to have ice cream that day, that is minimal to us on a scale. I love the scale of 1 to 10. With the littles, I use a scale of 1 to 5. And so for us, not having ice cream might be a 1, but to a 3-year-old, it might feel like a 3. Because they're in a different perspective of life than we are. They haven't seen some of the things we've seen. So I think the first thing I want to encourage parents to do is to when a child experiences or displays emotion, to do almost like a parental pivot and give your full attention to them. And at first, just acknowledge their feelings, because we want to teach kids to do that, to acknowledge what they're feeling. You might ask them, you look like you're upset. What are you feeling? And let them use some vocabulary. It'll help them develop that too. And then I think it's really important that we validate that. Oh, I can see you're disappointed you're not getting ice cream today if you have a little one. But then we're like, you and I are dealing with bigger things. We have older kids. And so wow, you did not get chosen for that activity, and you worked really hard to be able to do that. That has got to be frustrating and kind of just discouraging. And so beginning to build that vocabulary, validate those feelings, use a couple of vocabulary words, and then ask them, did I get that right? Sometimes a kid will tell me in my office, no, I don't feel that way at all. I'm relieved. Maybe my dad will back off and I don't have to do that anymore or something like that. But, first is just acknowledge the feeling, validate it, and then ask them maybe even where are they feeling it in their bodies? Because there is a somatic, we use a fancy psychological word, somatic component to this, and helping them identify it. Some people carry their feelings in their heart. Like little kids will point to their bellies sometimes. I know that I carry some of my stress in my shoulders, and I may feel sad in my eyes or in my heart, just different places. And so asking them where they feel it in their bodies. And then after we do all that, we can do a couple of other things. We can help them to release it. Why don't we breathe out some of that sadness? And so maybe we should all do this together. You want to do this with me, Robin, Joanna? You want to just take a deep breath and kind of like breathe out something that you felt this week, and just kind of maybe even make a little audible sound and just be like, just let a little bit of it go. And I think that's a great thing to do with a kid. And then to say to them, how could we give some of this to God? Might be a question you ask your child. And even I've prayed with my kids, and God has done some amazing answers in the midst of sadness and overwhelm. We have prayed, and He has literally answered. And I think we go back to that experiencing God model. I could have missed that opportunity by not praying, and we wouldn't have known God was involved, and the same thing would have happened. So I often pray that God would comfort my kids when they're sad, that He would be the lifters of their heads. Sometimes I pray that He would give me patience when they're sad, to allow them to feel their feelings. But I also pray that they would not get stuck in those feelings, that they would hold on to a hope that they have, not in anything on this earth, but in Him, in the person of Him and their relationship with Him. And that has proven to make a difference in the lives of my kids. And I see that making a difference in the lives of families at our offices.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, I read that in the book, and I just, I've kind of read some different books and studies on how we as adults carry that in our body, but it was kind of new to me to think, oh yeah, that's true of our kids too. They often carry those emotions physically with them. And so thanks for letting us breathe, because that felt good. I don't know if we could do that in every podcast, but I don't know. I'd be more relaxed probably if I could right in the middle of the podcast. So, I think I've mentioned this on our podcast before, but I grew up with 3 older brothers. And so I didn't have any sisters around the house when I was growing up. And so then God, with a sense of humor, gives me 3 daughters. And I have to say, when my little girls would come up to me with tears rolling down their face, that would just wreck me. And as a dad, I would want to fix it right away, move past that as quickly as possible, whatever it would take, But how can I, as a dad, learn to be more patient and present with my kids and their emotions?
I think it takes practice. I think it takes intentional mindset, and it may take some breathing. It may even there's a trick called mindfulness that I use sometimes because I'm a busy working mom where sometimes I have to take some breaths and like listen and just see what I see around me, what I hear around me, we use our five senses. It's called 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And it's just a way to bring us into the present. Sometimes I think bringing us into God's presence can help with that. And then taking a moment and just putting aside, whatever else is a distraction to us and giving our kids our full attention. And then I think what you talked about in that is so important. We do a lot of times want to fix it, but ultimately we want to empower our kids to go to God and learn to find solutions for themselves. So something I start asking my kids very young, I think around the age of 8, is how do you see you and God working together in the midst of your sad? And so it's a chance for them to think about, well, and sometimes I'd hear, it's not that sad, so maybe I just go on. And I'm like, well, you could try that and see how that goes. That's a great idea. And sometimes they'd be like, I don't know, it's just really bad and I don't know what to do, And that's where we can say, well, would you like to know what I think could maybe help? We could do that in that moment. But we also might say, why don't we pray and ask God to show us both what would be a good thing to do right now as you're hurting, and ask for his comfort. And what I tend to find in that moment, especially because human touch is such a part of healing, is as I remember one time I'm sitting in my home right now and I can see my driveway, sitting with my daughter. She had just expressed to me how overlooked she felt and how sad that was making her. And we just took a moment to pray together about that, because I think I was as sad as she was about her being overlooked in the moment. And together, us praying about that, there was just this peace that came over both of us. I think it's that thing that Philippians talks about, that peace that passes our understanding. And we both just had a sense of she was still probably going to be overlooked in this scenario, but it was manageable. It was something that we could manage together. And I told her, thank you so much for trusting me with this. And I think it's really important that parents reinforce to their kids that they're grateful when they come to them with their sadness, that it's not an intrusion for us. It's not an inconvenience, that we're honored. Think about it, that they would be vulnerable as we look at Brené Brown's work and share their hearts with us. What a privilege that is for us as parents. And I thank my kids often for being willing to share those intimate parts of their lives with me.
Yeah, I love that. We have 5 kids, and so they all tend to cope with their emotions a little bit uniquely. And some of them wear their heart on their sleeve, and some of them kind of carry things around for a while on the inside before you ever know what's going on. So sometimes our kids are feeling sad or having other hard emotions, but it's not always super obvious because they're not crying and they're not coming to us right away for hugs and comfort and reassurance. So could you give us some clues for those kids that our kids are feeling sad that we might not just recognize right away as parents?
Yeah, I think it's really important to look if they're starting to withdraw from you and from social activities. I just was working with a client today, and I'm concerned that we're starting to see some clinical depression because she's not happy with anything, and she's not happy with anything that's going on. And our kids can become like that. If they start to withdraw from their activities, they want to quit all the teams. Something I taught parents during COVID, and I still practice, and I have for years with my kids, and we check on this in the counseling office. It's part of one of our criteria. When we're looking for depression, we're looking for frequency and intensity. Those two aspects. So we're looking at how is this might be interfering in their lives. So I'll ask them, how'd you sleep last night? Very often, because I want to know that. I think that's a time they're vulnerable to spiritual attack. I think it's also a time that if they're not sleeping well regularly, that's a physical symptom, potentially of even an emotional problem. And I want to be aware of that. If your child all of a sudden has become more angry and defiant, it's not always a character issue. I know as Christian parents, we tend to be vulnerable to that belief. But a lot of times when a child becomes that way, a lot of times that anger is a secondary emotion to sadness, especially in the masculine community. Boys would rather be mad than sad. So I know when my husband was grieving his father, he kept saying, well, he's in a better place. He was in heaven. He's kind of rationalizing this grief, But in the midst of it, he was incredibly irritable. And I kind of told him, you know what? He said one day, why are you leaving to go do something? And I'm like, because you are no fun. And I love you and I want to be beside you. But until you own your grief, I know you think you're handling this internally. I don't want to be your emotional punching bag. And our kids at times can kind of emotionally punch on us when they're struggling. And then I think, especially if you see changes in their eating patterns, if they all of a sudden start eating a lot, they may be eating for comfort. Or if they're not eating, they may be experiencing that sadness in their tummies and it's keeping them from their food. So I love to ask my kids, when is the last time you cried? Because sometimes our kids hide their tears from us. The older they get, the more likely they are to do that. And the more private they are. I have one child who's a little more transparent than the other. And especially, Joanna, you mentioned this as you have different children with different wirings, which we all have. Sometimes we have to ask them, when's the last time you cried? And because that child is particularly private, sometimes it's been more recent than I realized because I haven't observed it.
Yeah, that's good. Those are such practical ways for us to keep our eyes open, I think. So thank you for that. Okay, so when I was growing up, I think the message that I was maybe inadvertently taught was that when you have a big emotion, the correct response is to basically suck it up, buttercup. That was kind of the, what I was encouraged to do. And there seemed to be almost a moral value placed on emotions, and everything you're describing is that the emotions themselves aren't right or wrong. They're just having them. So if you kind of have somehow internalized the fact that there's a little bit of judgment attached to feelings, how can we kind of work ourselves out of that so that we can really set our kids free to be where they're at?
I think we start by working on that ourselves. And I know that I've said several times I faced the recent loss of my father very suddenly, to me, at least. He could have been more sudden. I've treated more sudden in my office, but he was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer at the end of January of this year, and he died at the end of February. And we just had a service this past weekend. Mm-hmm. And I keep saying to my counselor, because I decided to create space for me to be able to grieve, because it's very easy for me to move through life and not do that. I'm surprised at how sad I am. And she said, why? You loved him. And I think there's something very real to that the more we love anything, whether we loved, like if a kid loses cheerleading or football and because of an injury and they loved it, they're going to be really sad about it. If there's a person, a grandparent who's very special to us, we're going to be sad. Sometimes we have emotional chains. And part of what this book is trying to help parents understand is that's not weakness. It's an indication that something is broken or hurt with us that needs to be addressed. And I think that's just an important way to look at emotion in that way, that it's not that we can trust God and still feel sad. I can know that my dad is in heaven. That's the spiritual me, right? But we live on earth. And I think it's really important as a Christian counselor, we use a psycho, I'm going to go real crazy here, spiritual social model is what I teach our therapists. And that's the idea that we do not experience things on earth just in the spiritual realm. We don't have just spiritual bodies. We have physical bodies. We have hearts that have emotions. We have minds that have thoughts. So I think we start, Joanna, by intentionally starting to break a lie of suck it up, buttercup, because suck it up, buttercup will put you in my office or on medication pretty fast.
Yes, it will.
To be honest with you. Yeah. Or it'll create a situation where you're like my husband was kind of doing, where you're outwardly exploding on everyone else. His brother once said to him one time, you don't feel feelings, you give them to the rest of us, And there can be a little truth to that. If we don't own our emotions, sometimes they're coming out in other ways. Because I think a lot of times kids are like icebergs. A lot of parents ask me about the teenagers. They look fine at school. How come they're struggling so much? And I'm like, who would go into a middle school where you're a target and open your wounds for everyone to see? I think that'd be foolish, right? So of course they're going to walk in there smiling and laughing and hugging, but there can still be things going on underneath that iceberg or that volcano that are unseen, that are real struggles of doubt and discouragement and insecurity that are just part of growing up and part of life. And if we don't get what's on the inside to the outside, it can get stuck, and it can get stuck in our bodies.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's why I think it's good for us as parents to go through this book with our kids, because we can work through it ourselves too, because some of us haven't, even been taught how to go through the process of feeling our sads and knowing how to kind of go through that. And I think sometimes, when it comes to sadness with our kids, we can think when we're coping with it, it should be a one and done kind of thing. But in your book, you describe it in a different way. You say some sadness goes away quickly, some sadness sticks around, and some sadness comes and goes like the waves of the ocean. The waves of sadness can wash over our kids again and again before we feel better. And I think this really challenges us as parents because we struggle sometimes with our kids just to know how to handle that. So how can you help us understand our kids' grief a little better today?
I think that that's a beautiful illustration. That's of the waves was one of the most important things I wanted in this children's book, because sometimes the waves are small and sometimes the waves are big and sometimes we can't control which one's going to hit us when. I'm experiencing that with grief right now. I mean, I'll have a doctor say, "How are you?" And all of a sudden, if I'm honest, I'm really sad right now. Or, I had a hairdresser say, "What?" She always knows I'm up to something fun and new, and I hadn't seen her since my dad got sick and died. And she's like, "So what's up? You traveling around? Hi, what's up? What's going on with you?" And I'm like, "Oh my gosh, I've got to somehow tell her that my dad died in the time of which I've seen her." And kids can have the same experience of just a moment where they start getting in touch with themselves and their emotions. They're not in that busy mode. And all of a sudden they feel things again. You know where most kids do that, guys? Bedtime, right? Because the world slows down at that time. And all of a sudden they have a chance to feel those feelings and face those fears. And we do a great job with them when we're little and we're tucking them in. And then as they get older and we're like barely making it out of activities and we're rolling them in bed, sometimes they face that alone, and sometimes they're not talking to us about it. And so I kind of jokingly switched it out. My kids are now teenagers and I make them tuck me in, and that's a time where I check in with them. And so I think it's really important, and why this is so important, Rob, is if we want the waves to come and to go, but if kids ignore it and if parents ignore it, there's another piece of research that says we begin to loop. Because emotion is energy in motion. And if it gets stuck in that body, almost like a pinball, like I'm going to date myself here really badly, like a pinball machine where that ball is just bouncing, 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 and it has nowhere to go, then it can get into a looping process. And when the emotion doesn't get released from the body and it doesn't get resolved, that looping can escalate the intensity of the emotion. It's kind of like a kid who says, "I want some ice cream." And you go, "Yeah, I know. If you want ice cream," and you kind of ignore them. And then they're like, "I want ice cream." And you're like, yeah, but you're not getting it. And then they're like, "I want ice cream." And I think that's what happens to emotions sometimes. It's like that. If you will take a moment and just say, "Hey, I know you really want some ice cream today, but unfortunately you have had enough sugar for today and that would be really bad for your brain and body. So let's look forward to having ice cream another day this week." A lot of times that kid will move on. But if we don't spend the time to do that, they're going to keep going because it's stuck in their brain and it's looping. And some kids naturally loop more than others. But all of us can have this experience, especially if something's traumatic to us. And we have to realize that some of us are prepared for things that happen to kids that they're unprepared for. And so it seems traumatic to them. And some spirits are just like you talked about, Joanna, they're just more sensitive than others. And when that happens, like two kids can watch the same thing and one of them will never even impact their brain or imprint on their body or their memory. And another child will still have flashbacks of that 10 years from then. And some of that has to do with birth order. Some of that has to do with sensitivity. I believe some of that has to do with like what the enemy chooses to use against one kid versus another in the process.
Yeah, I love that because I think as parents, sometimes we can try to quickly get our kids to move past something because we do think they're just, get over it. You don't need ice cream right now. But then I look at myself and I think sometimes how I might be feeling sad or anxious or some emotion and how I will fixate on certain things as I start getting anxious, and sometimes just like you said, having that conversation with the kid and not just assuming they're being, selfish or whiny or, whatever. They may be using ice cream as a way to fix something that they're feeling. You know what I'm saying?
Exactly. There can definitely be metaphors at times going on with kids. And I sometimes find metaphors in our office helpful, but at times I will look at a kid sometimes and say, "Wow, you're saying all this with a smile on your face, but I wonder how your heart feels." And boy, sometimes the tears will roll. My heart hurts. It's hard that my mom and dad aren't going to live together anymore. And I don't know where I'm living yet. The kids face difficult things. They face moves. They face, like you guys talked about, they faced a friend's rejection. They face not feeling good enough. Not everybody's going to be great in math. And in a world that values performance and appearance and other people's approval, I think it's really important that our kids be grounded in a sense of an identity in God's love. That's why I wrote the very first book I wrote, Loved and Cherished. But also, I think our kids need to understand that they're not going to measure up in this world because it's impossible to do. And that's why we have God. But they need us to be that safe place to land. They need our homes to be a place to say, it's okay that you're not everything to everyone. And it's okay that you feel it's difficult when you realize that you feel less than, and it creates emotions in you. It creates that in all of us.
Yeah. And, I love your reminder that our kids might be a little more sensitive at the end of the day when the day slows down. That was a really good point. And talking about grief, it was making me think about how it was at bedtime that our son would remember the dog that we had that had passed away. And you also said each kid's going to respond differently. The other kids seemed to roll through that pretty quickly. But for him, he's the one that needed the little mementos. He's the one that saved the collar. He's the one that saved the little scarf that she used to wear. And it would come up at bedtime. And it went on much longer than I would have expected. But I think with that, it's kind of neat that bedtime is also one of the most precious times of the day that we can connect with our kids in prayer. And in the book, you definitely it's just beautiful the way you point kids to pray to God when they're sad. So maybe for some parents where that's a new pattern for them, what are some practical ways that we can help our kids to feel more confident in praying?
I wanted to respond to one thing you said there because I think it's really important with the dog thing. Sometimes the dog is also a symbol of more. My son was very sad when our dog died, but it came in a season where, unfortunately, we lost my husband's twin sister and her husband to cancer, and it left behind 3 kids under 10. And so when my son was sad about the dog, he actually was really also sad about his Aunt Jennifer and his Uncle Dwight. So sometimes kids will talk about being sad about one thing, but there's other things they're sad about. So I want to encourage you when that continues to maybe talk about what other sad things does the dog remind you of in that process? And then as we pray for our kids with that and through that, I think first we want to pray just like I've been talking about. We want to pray by acknowledging that we're sad. Let's do ourselves, because I think to begin this process, we need to learn this process ourselves. So I'll do it on me. God, I am so sad that my dad no longer walks on this earth, although I'm so glad he's with you. And Lord, I just pray that in the midst of this, that you would help me turn to you for comfort instead of other things that would be tempting for me to turn to comfort in. And God, may I just sense your love and presence. And I thank you for sending people to me who would be your vessels of comfort and how much they've encouraged me. And Lord, I just pray that as I grieve, you would give me patience with myself, to give myself time to do that, to allow for times of rest more than I normally would have, and to be okay with not being okay sometimes, to even warn my kids when I am feeling just emotionally on edge that this might not be the good time for a debate on a major topic, and maybe picking a different time, and to just be honest and vulnerable. And I pray you'd help me with that, God, in Jesus' name. Amen. So I would keep it short. I would acknowledge the child's feeling in prayer. I would ask for God's help. I would point out any ways that you may have already seen God's help and interaction in that, or helping us look for that. And then just also giving permission for us to come back to that feeling. Because we know this isn't the only time a child's this is not the only time I'm going to experience grief. I still have a mother who's living and siblings. And, it's just reality that there's going to be grief in this world. And I don't think we dwell there all the time. I'm a big fan of all the emotions, including I still want to celebrate big when it's good. But I think when it is hard that we give space for that. And sometimes we take grief breaks. I think those are important too. In the midst of my nieces and nephew losing their parents, we all went to Six Flags one day, and we just took a break from the grief, every single one of us. And that was very helpful to us.
That's great. That's great. Today I'm thinking of the parents whose kids are feeling sad because they've witnessed traumatic events like children being killed in school shootings. And, what would you say to those parents who want to help their kids cope with those images and feelings?
First, I would say don't overexpose them to the images. because I know that I was a middle school counselor during 9/11, and I really encouraged teachers to get the TVs turned off. I'm like, you're giving my kids secondary PTSD over and over again. I know you want to see this. Put it in the lounge, put it somewhere else. So if you need to watch stuff on the news, maybe put in some headphones, maybe distract the kids. One of you takes the kids somewhere. Don't overexpose them to world events, especially ones that they're almost too mature to manage at times. But acknowledge we live in a broken world, and it's going to affect us. John 16:33 says that we are going to suffer, not if, but when. And I think we need to celebrate when times are really good, like I talked about, but we need to honor those tough times and realize that our kids are younger and they may respond to traumatic events with fear. It's very common, and they may have bigger emotions than we do. I think it's important to remind them that God's got a future for them and that we can trust them. But I think it's also important that we realize that trauma is going to affect our mind, our body, and our spirit. And this is what I teach in Trauma 101 when I'm teaching it at a university, or I'm teaching it to ministers, or I'm teaching it to parents. And that is that trauma affects the way we view God, the way we view ourselves, and the way we view our world. So when kids hear about shootings, they have questions like, why didn't God protect them from that? And I think we need to address those hard questions that Philip Yancey writes books about so well. And then I think also that it's going to affect the way we view ourselves. Am I safe? Am I capable of handling a situation like that? And then it's going to affect the way we view our world. A lot of kids begin to, and we're very privileged. We live in a country where our kids don't walk to school and have to worry about a grenade going off or something like that. And I don't know if we'll always have that privilege, but I think we have to help our kids learn to cope with the world that they live in, but also realize that the reason something is news is because it's unusual. My son developed a lot of stomach issues, and I thought he had a bug that wouldn't go away. And I took him to our pediatrician, and normally she's telling me to take my counselor hat off. We're on boards together, and put my mom hat on. Well, this day she goes, I'm going to do something really strange for you. I need you to take your mom hat off. I'm going to talk to you as a clinician. I'm going to read to you a caseload of symptoms. I'm like, recent death in the family, very traumatic, unusual, kids having stomach issues, keeps coming home from school. And I'm like, oh my gosh, he's got school refusal and separation anxiety. So I looked straight at my son and I said, are you scared mommy and daddy are going to die? And he starts weeping and says to me, I mean, this is a 4-year-old, 5-year-old. Mommy, every night I pray that you get sick and the daddy's plane blows up and I can't find my sister. And you can just imagine how the enemy's just after that in the middle of the night. And I had to explain to him, I didn't even think about telling him both parents don't usually die in a family, that's very unusual. He had globalized that. And that's something that you might need to know. Sometimes kids will globalize something and make it seem, and then they'll personalize it. They'll make it seem like it's normal, and then they'll make it seem like it's going to happen to them. And so we have to help them with that, to realize this doesn't happen very often. This is not global. And this is not probably going to happen to you. And I'm also really careful with this because I don't want to sell my kids a false bill of goods. So I also tell them, because I unfortunately sit in a chair where the bad things happen to people, and I help them with that. So I tell them, and this is a phrase I've used since they were itty bitty, and they know this phrase so well. And if it were to happen, there is nothing that's going to happen to you that you and I and God can't handle together. And I even talk about it, do you feel like your cousins are safe and they feel loved and they feel secure, even though they miss their parents? And he's like, yes, because we all love them. And I was like, exactly. God provides lots of vessels. And that's what I think is really important as we see traumatic events happen. I think this is more scared than sad. I think kids can be. If you got a really empathetic kid, I'm obviously a huge mercy. I will feel other people's pain. And I am sad about the families and their loss and what they're experiencing. I can't even start talking about babies dying because it will just break me apart. But I have great compassion and empathy for them, like I think Jesus did for hurting people. And if that's where your child is, I think you want to just really validate that gift that they have. And then sometimes we need to find a practical way to help them with that. Like I know that I needed something practical. So right now we're taking donations for God I Feel Sad to go into that school community and into foster care systems. So kids in need can have that book. And so sometimes I will have kids, when I was a school counselor, we would write cards and we would take it to a kid who'd been injured. Just having something you can do makes you feel helpful and useful. And it's helpful. There's research that says that acts of kindness actually alleviate depression and sadness in people. So I think those are ways we can talk to our kids about those events, but also help them cope with them.
Oh, wow. That's tremendous. You've given us so much just with that one response. Thank you. Okay, so what about the kiddo who is sad, but like you mentioned before, they have gotten kind of stuck in it, or they are looping, or you just see those physical symptoms manifesting worse and worse and worse, and you're moving kind of deeper into the sadness instead of working your way to the other side. Like, how is a parent able to recognize that their child might need more than the support they can just get at home?
I would say if you have a question about that, talk to your doctor or come see one of us. Because I will tell you, I interviewed Crystal Payne one time on the Raising Mentally Healthy Kids podcast. And Crystal said if she could go back and do one thing again, she would establish a relationship with mental health professionals before she ever needed them. Because when you need them and it's really bad, we're not an easy system at that point. We're an emergency system, and that's not what you want. And so I had a woman, I'll never forget her. She brought her 14-year-old boy into my office. I was a young clinician. I don't think I had children at this point. And she said, I'm really worried about him. I think he's really depressed. He spends a lot of time in his room. And so he and I did a full assessment on him in the first session. And she came back in afterwards and she said, so is he bad? Do I need to take him to a doctor? And I'm like, are you an extrovert? She's like, oh, yeah, I love to go do stuff. I'm the PTA mom. I'm like, yeah, I had a feeling. I said, I talked to your son, and unless he's hiding something from me, your son is a very typical male introvert. I have one of those. I don't know. I bet y'all have at least one of those. Rob, you may be one. I'm married to one. And so I told her the amount of social action your son and activity he has is completely typical for an introvert. And she was so funny. She's like, don't even bill my insurance. She writes me a check and she says, best check I've ever written. And it was just the funniest phrase. And I was like, why is that? And she goes, because I've been so worried, and I'm not worried anymore. I feel like this mental health checkup, just like you might have a checkup with your kid if you think they might be sick. I'm not looking to get more business. Believe me, we have plenty of business as mental health professionals. But I think if you're concerned, it is better not to ignore something and address it and know that you're okay. And it's maybe a couple sessions. And then you've got the relationship should you need it later, than to be where I just had a set of parents call me that I had done marriage counseling with over a decade ago. And they were desperate. They were like, oh my gosh, we saw you on the insurance panel. And I guess I'm old because they were like, we were wondering if you were still practicing. We didn't even think about how to get a hold of you. And then we saw your name. We thought we'd call you. And they were like, their daughter had asked for counseling and they'd ignored it. And I would just tell you, if your child is asking for help, get them help. If you don't think they need it, let one of us tell you they don't need it. Because if they're asking for help, there may be reasons you're not aware of. And sure enough, she got hold of a journal, and then she realized that this child had been suicidal and they were just sick. They had ignored that cry for help. So I just want to so encourage parents, if you start seeing a change in activity level, friends, interest patterns, your engagement with them. Now, some of that is normal. I still am having a hard time. There's a book that's a clinical book, but it's for parents too, called Untangled. And it's about the idea of especially girls like to untangle for their moms in teenage years. And she gives you 7 things. If your kid's doing this, let them untangle well. And I have to go back and review that every once in a while because I miss my relationship with my 3-year-old daughter. She was adorable and we had so much fun together, but I want her to become a confident grown woman. So I'm not talking about that natural progression. I'm talking about a complete shutdown and shut off. When you start seeing that, when you start seeing acting out behaviors, when you start seeing new groups of friends, please, if you start seeing marks on their arms, if they're not sleeping at night, a lot of parents ignore that. I love the idea of giving them calm gummies or whatever, but that's a symptom. That's a physical symptom of possibly a bigger issue. And it may just be us helping them develop some sleep habits, but it could be something that you're not aware of, they haven't talked to you about, like maybe a boy broke their heart. And while you think they should be over it, they're not. And they're struggling with their first experience of rejection. And some of us have forgotten how it felt, or maybe you married the person you first fell in love with and you don't know the devastation of that. And so and different kids work differently. Some will talk to all their friends about it, and they kind of use each other as peer counselors, which I think can be good when it's small stuff. When I think a kid's severe and they're using their friends as peer counselors, your kids can get symptoms from that. We have strict boundaries so that we don't get unhealthy ourselves. And I have parents who come in who have kids who have mental illness issues, and they need help just supporting them through that. I wish every special needs mom could have a counselor just free of charge to support them through the challenges they face with kids who struggle like that. But I think getting back to this question, because I can go down a rabbit hole pretty fast, I think you guys have figured out, I think it's really important that if in doubt, check it out and get some help.
Well, thank you for that. That is really helpful.
Yeah, that's great. And that was all very helpful information. So I didn't think you were going down a rabbit trail at all. So that was great. One of the, most beautiful messages you share is that God's love and goodness are everywhere and all around us. And so, even when we're feeling sad. So how can we help our kids have eyes to see God's message of hope to them, even when they're feeling sad?
My sister practices a practice that some families do and some people don't. She does it with her adult kids, which I thought was hysterical in a nice restaurant recently. But they do, when they're little, we call it sunshine and clouds sometimes. And sometimes we can call it highs and lows, but just even encouraging our kids, and not always what they're eating, because sometimes we don't want that to interfere with our digestive processes, but even just when we're in a car. I ask my kids very often, what was the hardest part of your day? And then did anything happen that made you feel good? And a lot of times they're like, no. And I'm like, you didn't understand something in class, or have a friend just really smile at you. And so I'm pointing out to them things that we can rejoice in and learning to look for the good. I think if it's really important we train our brains. I know that even though I'm in the midst of a really difficult time in my life, I just recovered from a knee replacement. My dad just died, and my assistant has decided to become a librarian, which I'm very excited about for them, but not for me. And so in the midst of this difficult time, I could look at this and just literally have a panic attack and be overwhelmed all the time. But while this is going on, I have a great marriage and a husband who loves me. The reason I'm so sad about my dad is because I come from this great loving family that had its own struggles in it, don't get me wrong, but that has been a support. We've been a support to each other through this, that I am so privileged to get to run a practice of Christian counselors that want to help people, and that God, even in the midst of some struggles like this, he's always previously provided. I can just rehearse God's faithfulness. And sometimes I think that's another way we can help our kids see good, is just rehearse the faithfulness of God in our lives and in our families and in their lives. I've mentioned to my kids before, I remember when you really hated and weren't very good at soccer, just like you're struggling with baseball because you're new at it. But over time, you got better at it. You got to play more, and you really love it now. And I could see that happening with baseball. A good friend of mine, John Trent, talks about this in his book, The Blessing, that we project God at work in our kids' lives in the future. And not all sunshine and roses, but I do believe that God is out there working for our good, and he's got a hope and a future for these kids. And I think the world's trying to tell them there's none left for them. And we need to remind them that God hasn't changed, and there's still goodness to be had in life.
Amen to that. Yeah, that is so beautiful. I'm pretty sure that today there's a mom or a dad listening who's just really burdened for their child, and they so much want to see those messages of hope too for their kids and their family. We were hoping before we say goodbye today that you might pray for them, just to see God's goodness and help their kids to see him too. Could you do that with us?
Absolutely. I would love to. God, this world has a lot of suffering in it because it's broken, but this is also a world with a lot of you at work and a lot of blessing. Help us to acknowledge the hard while still embracing the good in our lives. And I pray specifically for that parent who's really worried about their child. God, I pray that as they interact with you about that you would give them wisdom and direction. I pray that you would place people alongside them to support them. I pray, God, that they would find the help they need, and they would not try to do this alone. God, sometimes it's hard to talk about our kids' weaknesses with others because we don't want others to use that against them. But I pray that they would find safe places and safe people to share that burden with. And Lord, I pray that you would encourage them, that Lord, I think I pray very often for every kid that the knowledge that their brains aren't fully developed till about the age of 24 to 28. And so we are dealing with undeveloped brains, most of us as parents. Help us to remember that. Help us to remember there's still more of you at work in their lives. And just as you rejoice over the one sheep out of 100 that disappears, and just, God, that you have promised that you're not going to let them go. And Lord, I pray that that would give that parent hope, even in the midst of the messy, because Lord, raising kids is messy for sure. And Lord, help us as parents while we're doing that to stay mentally healthy ourselves so that we can be good role models of that. Help us to seek help when we need help. Sometimes our kids won't get help, but the thing that will get them to get help is we will be humble enough to submit ourselves to someone else's care and guidance and acknowledge our need for help. And I have seen that in our offices, God move mountains in kids' hearts. So I pray for that parent that if they are the one it starts with, that it would start with them. And I pray that they would hold on to hope and claim that hope for a future like we talked about. God, help them to do that in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. Thank you for that. Michelle, I know that we've just scratched the surface today of all the insight that you have on kids and their emotions. And we're going to make sure that we put all of the right links in the show notes and things to your podcast and everything. But what's the best way that people can learn more about you and find you online to get God, I Feel Sad, or the other resources, and learn about your podcast and that kind of thing? Where can people go?
Yeah, you can put my name and spell it as best you can in Amazon or Christian Book or any of those retailers and see some of those resources. You can visit yourmentalhealthcoach.com or raisingmentallyhealthykids.com will get you the landing page to the podcast. And I love to interact with parents on social media. I'm posting a lot of things about some of the answers to your questions. About how to sit alongside a kid. And because you know what, I think, guys, a lot of times, I know for me at least, and this was the best piece of Christian advice I'd ever gotten. And I was in I think I was in college. I was working for a guy named Louis Giglio at the time. And I was at a conference with a bunch of big name speakers. And one of them said to me, young lady, your challenge will not be to learn a lot of new, but to remember what you've learned and use it. And that's where I think we need, some of us know what's in God, I Feel Sad, but we need a book like that once again to remind us. Maybe we've got a 15-year-old and now we have a 3-year-old, and we need to be reminded to be patient in those toddler years where that brain is growing and pruning and creating connections. And in the midst of that, the emotions are flying. And so I think it's so important that we find people. I know that I am constantly not only learning, but also being reminded of truth that makes a difference in my life every day. And that's a great way to retrain your brain as well.
Thank you for that, Michelle. You know, it's kind of been a heavy topic that we've tackled today, but you made it so uplifting for all of us. So thank you so much. And thank you again for sharing your time today.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Yes, and thank you, friends, for joining us today on the podcast. We would love to connect with you over on our website as well, growinghometogether.com. You'll find all kinds of resources to pray for your kids, create meaningful conversations, laugh together, and stay strong as a couple in your parenting and as partners too. So at Growing Home Together, we are caring for the soul of your family.
And we're growing home together with you. Bye.
Bye.